Hello, everyone out there. Hi. Welcome to the Musical QuaranStream with Glen and Bri. I am Glen,
I'm Bri.
and this is the Musical QuaranStream. This is where we sit and talk for 2 times a week about musical theater, theater in general, entertainment, all of that fun stuff. And we pitch a show before the show is done. So let's see, what have we been watching that we need to tell people about?
I don't know, not much different right now.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
There
I
was,
baked a cake. That was
yeah,
big, exciting news.
she baked a very amazing cake, a chocolate cake recipe from Tasty on YouTube, which was really, really awesome.
Yep. And I developed my own recipe for almond fruit bars, which was
There you go.
really good.
Yeah, which you can find on her Twitter,
Yeah.
which is listed right there, right under her beautiful smiling face.
And I'd love to see people make it because it works for me. But, I think that's the true test of a recipe, is if it works for you.
Yeah, and we have, let's see, we watched the Sherman Brothers documentary on Disney,
That's good.
which was very good. Sherman Brothers composed music for just about every classic Disney live action show and a lot of their animated shows as well.
Well, it made me really think, like they were saying, how they kind of wrote family entertainment show music, and I think as a kid who was raised on a lot of things like Winnie the Pooh and Jungle Book and stuff like that they wrote for, I think it really spoke a lot of what the Sherman Brothers did as far as vocabulary and music that made me really interested in kind of Gilbert and Sullivan at the same time. And I don't think that that's necessarily something they would claim, but I think out of all of the vocabulary and words that they made up and everything, I think if you're kind of like an English, my mom was an English teacher, so like an English lit, word loving person, I think that it made a lot of sense that you love both the Sherman Brothers music and something like Gilbert and Sullivan music for the vocabulary alone.
Yeah, and if you're not someone who's already familiar with the Sherman Brothers' work, and you're like, well, what did they write? Mary Poppins, Bedknobs and Broomsticks, lots of the little live action movies that Disney did, like the Gnome Mobile was one of theirs, wasn't it?
Yeah, anything at Disney, I think from like the 50s. Gosh, until like they said 2000 when they wrote for the Tigger movie.
Yeah.
And then I think that they had almost any piece of children's media or entertainment that you probably saw in the 80s and 90s. Yeah. Like they said, The Slipper and the Rose and the Cabbage Patch movie.
And they wrote Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, the music from that. They basically are the sound of a massive amount of the population's childhood is what it comes down to.
And, I think a lot of, pop music you probably heard in the 50s and 60s as well. Like, they said one of their first big hits for Annette Funicello was Tall Paul, which I know, I knew in a completely different context because my mom listened to that type of music growing up. So,
yeah. So that was a really interesting documentary to watch. We've been watching our usual suspects on YouTube. Hello, Bristol. Nice to see you guys tuning in. We've been watching Wizards, sort of the penultimate entry into Guillermo del Toro's Tales of Arcadia series, which there was Troll Hunters, and then Three Below, and now Wizards, and there's an upcoming movie that's going to be like the capstone on the whole series.
Yeah, which I think I started watching because it was Anton Yelchin who was Chekhov in the new Star Trek, and then he passed away suddenly. And, and then this upcoming one, I don't think it's like he hates them, but I think Guillermo del Toro really does not like cats. Just because I think that he has pet rats, and so he has a lot of feelings about them. So I was really kind of surprised that he had a show that featured a cat positively.
I think that I mean, I don't know. I may not have read the same interviews with him that you have read, but my feeling from Guillermo del Toro has always been that it's not that he hates cats. He feels like cats are kind of a cliche pet to have in a show.
Well, the last thing I saw was Shape of Water where cats were eaten, so...
Yes, that is true. That is... which that... a nice notice going in would have been good for both of us. Because each of us hit that scene and was kind of like, oh no.
Well,
We don't like the cute fish monster anymore.
I think... Well, and I think Glenn for sure, like, being a horror movie buff, you're like, okay, well, let's just get through it. And I was like, we're leaving right now. I don't care where we pay for the ticket. We gotta leave. It's like, no, let's just stay and wait it out. It's fine.
But yeah, so that is a good series we have been watching. And we've been having lots and lots of philosophical discussions about media, some of which are inspiring upcoming episodes of The Film Optimist, which The Film Optimist has a new episode coming out this Monday morning. And if you are a patron on my Patreon, I think right now I have two patrons. But if you're a patron on Patreon, you can go there and you can actually see the episode before it goes live on YouTube.
But we love both of you.
Yes, we love both of you. Thank you very much. So...
It's not about the quantity, it's about the quality.
Absolutely.
But that's really exciting because that means we'll have updates from us, the Musical QuaranStream, as long as we keep going on Wednesdays and Sundays, and then we'll have updates of the Film Optimist on Mondays. So having something that's going to be producing media 3 times a week, I think, was a big goal, especially for Glenn at the start of the pandemic, and hopefully y'all will enjoy those types of things that were like being put out. But like, you know, one of the discussions we were talking about today, in lieu of prepping for the material today, which is scientifically based, you know, like we kind of talked about, we love Soundfield, we love Eons, we love the Brain Scoop, which is coming out of the Field Museum. There's a lot of like really great science material being produced on YouTube, which I think is really critical with you know, people doing school from home and trying to find kind of good resources to pique children's curiosity and interest. And one of the things like we kind of mentioned is while we love modern children's media, I'm not trying to like take it away, because for me, I love it because it breeds empathy, it breeds kind of these psychological, emotional savvy skills that kids really need. But we were also kind of talking about, like, I asked the other day, whatever happened to the Biodome? Whatever happened to the La Brea tar pits? Like, all the stuff that we saw in so much media in the late 80s, early 90s when we were little kids that were getting us interested in stuff like Space Camp and Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And, you know, there was just so many, it seemed like, scientific features that, as silly as it was talking about quicksand and a variety of like children's animated cartoons, you know, that was also something I think really piqued a lot of our imaginations of, oh, what would it be like to live in a biodome? What would what would it be like to visit the tar pits or the Berlin Wall or something like that? And so I started kind of like looking up a lot of that stuff, and it just seemed like there was a lot of media that used to just be very episodic, that would try to like find something to feature for kids every week. So maybe like every single episode, you know, along with like Halloween, Christmas or something, would have like, they all go to space, or, you know, they all do that. But now, I mean, there still is a bit of that. I'm not gonna like say there's not, but it does seem like there's more of a through arc of, you know, if you have the great fortune of doing well in your first season, they'll kind of give you a couple more seasons to help kind of tell the hero's journey of each animated character, which didn't really happen with a lot of our cartoons.
No, and it's happening more often as well with adult-oriented entertainment as well. You know, I mentioned in our conversation, I said, you know, it used to be that even something in prime time like MacGyver was episodic. And it's not out of place to imagine, like, if you have an episodic MacGyver, then when Sweeps comes along or a special event comes along or something like that, then you would send him to NASA's JPL, to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And there would be a story in that episode that would be a typical MacGyver story, but there would also be a lot of talk about, look at the kind of important science that's going on at JPL, and they would shoot it on location. And nowadays, most of primetime entertainment is really centered around telling a serial story, just like Bri said about children's entertainment. So when Sweeps comes along, you don't go to JPL, you don't go to France, you don't go to someplace to show... Yeah, you don't go to someplace to show people the world. When Sweeps comes along, that's when you focus really hard on the core lore of the show. So you have them instead in the same sets they're always in the same places they're always in, because they're getting really intense on the story you've been following since the beginning of the show.
Yeah. We're talking about Rosemary and Thyme is a detective series we like. And we're also talking about this with the CBS studios in Honolulu, Hawaii. And how there definitely seemed to be kind of this investment in travel a bit more and kind of exposure, so that maybe middle America would want to go on vacation or invest something, or I don't know, it just seemed really kind of a shift. And of course we're both 40 years old, so this is a long time ago, and we realize we're now old generation, not young generation, but it definitely is a different, I think, flavor of particularly television media, of what we're seeing, what is being produced versus kind of what we were exposed to as younger people, consumers.
And it's not to say that the changes that have happened to television are necessarily a bad thing, but there are always trade-offs. So you wind up with more mature, long-lasting story arcs that tell a complete story versus an episodic format where nothing ever really grows or changes. That's a positive change, but you also lose the ability of telling stories for an episode that allow you to focus on, here's a thing that people might not know about. And I think that probably, like you said, there are still a few shows that manage to pull this off. Bones, for a while, before its final season, Bones was really good about, we're taking a trip out to this laboratory where they're conducting this kind of research and things like that. So,
and I think the holiday episodes are still pretty mandated, especially at Cartoon Network, and I think Nickelodeon. A lot of people say it's kind of forced that you have to have a Christmas or a camp or a Halloween or something episode.
I will never forget the story of Invader Zim's Christmas episode, where Jan Vasquez, the creator of Invader Zim, as I understand it, basically showed up, was told his series had been canceled, but they wanted a Christmas special from him for the TV series. But they had also already fired the rest of the crew on his show, so he was going to have to go around the studio himself and find people working on other shows to help him put together the special for his show. So yeah, it's still a thing that there are individual episodes that are like, the network can come to you and say, you absolutely need an episode like this. But
well, and I got thinking about this because, I guess, spoiler alert, what Glenn's going to be talking about is dinosaurs. And one of my favorite series of the summer has been, I think it's called Paleontology Road Trip or Dinosaur Road Trip with Dr. Emily Grassley. And I really enjoyed it. It was 3 episodes, and I painted the whole wall behind me listening to it. Just put it up on the TV and painted. And we still got to paint this wall.
Yeah,
so, maybe if I can find it again, we'll paint this wall. But I really enjoyed it because my sister and her spouse, for their honeymoon, traveled all over the country and went to a whole bunch of national parks. And, it seemed really scary to me. Like, I'm scared of a lot of things, just, FYI. Don't like horror movies. Driving across the country, there's a lot of just like open space. It's very undeveloped, and there's not a lot of cities or gas stations in between. So I would always have my heart in my chest, just jump to my throat whenever they'd be like, "Oh, we're driving through South Dakota, and here's this large stretch. I hope we don't run out of gas." and so I never really felt like a big interest to drive across the country in that same respect to how they did, because they're like, I'm go from Ohio, and go here, and go down here, and go here, and they kind of did a little triangle or rectangle across the country from Ohio and back. And that always made me like super nervous. Like I'm not a good driver, and I'm really lucky that Glenn likes to drive. But I would always be like, oh, if I'm gonna go see Monterey Bay or the Redwood or something, I'm taking a plane. But the paleontology road trip goes through 5 different states, and it's like the Dakotas and Montana and Colorado and all these places. And what I guess I didn't realize at the time was how many state parks are just open to dinosaurs. Like they're just like, you can go see these dinosaur tracks, you can help us excavate a dinosaur, you can look at all these like wonderful museums. And I love a good free forest station. Like we went to like just accidentally in West Virginia to a forest station when they were doing Smokey the Bear's 75th anniversary.
Yeah.
And I just really had to go to the bathroom. But like they were the sweetest people and gave us so much free stuff. And it was so interesting to talk with them about like what they do at the forest station, about Smokey the Bear. And so I was kind of like, I might be persuaded for my love of fossils and dinosaurs and, kind of that joy I've held ever since I was a little kid, to maybe do a cross-country trip so that we can go walk in these footsteps of fossilized dinosaurs and help excavate this big dinosaur plot in Montana. Like, I just never thought that would be something I'd be really wanting to do, but there's so many cool things that they showcased in like these states that really that's all it is, because back in, whatever, eons ago, there was like one range of mountains that was on like the west coast and one range of mountains that was on the east coast, and everything else was water. So there's all these bones and lots of like fish, and it just seems so cool.
Yeah, and Paleontology Road Trip, that is hosted by the woman who does The Brain Scoop on YouTube, which I think we discussed a little bit in our last episode. It's a great YouTube channel. If you haven't checked that out yet, you really should check it out. It's a lot of great information about archaeology, about paleontology, about figuring out what happened with life in history on
I
the
love
Earth.
a good natural history museum.
Yes.
Like, I used to live on Capitol Hill at the YWCA, right behind Capitol Hill. And literally, like, one of, like, the best features of that, being a, poor broke grad student just trying to do research, is you could just go down to the Smithsonian and you could do a different Smithsonian. And so, like, being able to see, like, Natural History Museum, the African American History Museum, the Arts Museum. They have like a classical and a modern portrait gallery, air and space. There's the American History one where the Muppets and the Dorothy's shoes. So I love a good museum. It's some of like my favorite things to do, and I think like when we were thinking about moving to Columbus, one of the things is we went to the art museum and we went to like the largest library downtown, and we're like, oh, this is really nice. Columbus is a great place.
Yes.
So, I think that anytime you can kind of talk about natural history, which is like, being able to watch the paleontology road trip and being able to watch the Brain Scoop, it's like, as much as I love Chicago, and I've been there, a few times already, I have friends that live there. Most of the time when I go, it's to see improv groups or theater, of course, because we're theater people. But I was like, I really want to go back and do the touristy field museum thing. I think it would be fun.
It comes as an absolute shock to me to learn that my co-host in the Musical QuaranStream is a really big theater person.
Yeah. Well, the one thing I love about Chicago theater, okay, shout out Chicago theaters, is every single time I've gone, there are two shows that you can see almost every night of the week. Now, granted, it's because like Chicago's not a union town.
Yes.
But it's like, all right, we're going to go to our 7 p.m. show, and now we're going to go to, like, our 10:30, 11 o'clock show. Yes. And so you can fit a lot in a short amount of time.
Bri's favorite thing about Chicago theater is enabled by my least favorite thing about Chicago theater. And that's how it happens. That's how it happens a lot in capitalism. Let's be perfectly honest here.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's just really fun to be able to see like 2 shows a night, and there's a lot of like really nice bars. I mean, like everything that happened in Chicago was because of the mob. So
well, and
good drinks and lots of young kids just trying to make a living doing theater.
Well, and I think it's appropriate to talk about the things that everyone enjoys, that have been enabled by some really bad things.
I like New York theater too, and New York is very, very union town.
But I think that's very appropriate because the broader topic, you mentioned we're going to be talking about dinosaurs in my pitch today, but the broader topic I kind of wanted to take a look at was this concept of cultural imperialism.
Mm-hmm.
And there's imperialism in general can be summed up as basically one group of people looking at the rest of the world and saying, the world is a mess and I just need to rule it. So you have things like you have the Ottoman Empire, you have the British Empire, basically people going around the world and determining your way of life, the way you set your world up and everything like that. That's not a real thing. We're here to show you the proper way to do things, is what people tend to think of when they think of imperialism. And then cultural imperialism is how you wind up with things like the British National Museum, aka the world's largest active crime scene, where you have an awful lot of world history that is beautifully preserved and laid out and made available to the public to walk through. It's just that none of it is in the place where it actually should be, because all of that stuff belonged to people. And England just basically showed up and said, well, you know, these marbles on the Acropolis are absolutely lovely, and they're doing nobody good sitting out here on the Acropolis, so let's just crowbar all of them off and take them back to England.
I'd say two pieces of pop culture if you want kind of a very, very basic introduction that's very small part of the plot. One is the new Sherlock. They had an episode that was dealing with Chinese antiquities, which was kind of talking about this. And then, of course, Black Panther.
Yeah. Black Panther is a great example, and you see a lot of this still happening in the news. I mean, in general, there are things like the American entertainment industry engages in a lot of cultural imperialism because it grows by trying to convince people worldwide that American popular culture is the best popular culture. To the point, and it works enough for Americans, to the point that many Americans are shocked when you tell them that India produces more movies every year than the United States does. To the order of about double. They're close to producing double the movies that Hollywood produces every year in the professional Indian cinema industry.
I think that's like some of my favorite like listicles you'll see is like foreign people coming to America and just being like, all right, how much of your media is aspirational or how much of it is real? Like, does your mom really cook you like 16 different things for breakfast and nobody eats it? And like, do you guys really go to prom? What is a prom?
And you have other areas of the world where they've worked very hard to sort of stop the encroachment of American cultural imperialism. Interestingly enough, one of those, Canada. That I always love the fact that Canada, in, I think it was around about the 70s or so, was like, hey, isn't it strange that an awful lot of American entertainers were born in Canada and went down to America to find work entertaining instead of working for our industry up here? That's so strange, and we put a lot of American media on our television and radio. So they responded with an actual law requiring Canadian content, or the CanCon law, which basically said, you know, if you own a television station, if you own a radio station, a certain percentage of your content every day has to be produced in Canada. It can't be Canadian performers performing for a United States producer. It has to be Canadian-created content. And that worked really well to help prop up their entertainment industry.
I was going to say, that's why we now have Degrassi and Schitt's Creek.
Yes, that is absolutely true. And we also have the great 1980s band Can, whose name was based on the Can law. But in talking about like the subjects that we wanted to talk about for our series on social topics, I was like, I kind of want to do cultural imperialism, and we got into talking about this historical event called the Bone Wars, which is not what you would typically think of when you think of cultural imperialism, but it does tie in so nicely. And it is such an example of cultural imperialism taken to an extreme. Because it's genuinely people of a small insular culture deciding that their culture and their particular place in the culture was more important than the history of the entire world, life as we know it. So they were going to do whatever they wanted to with this historical evidence in order to create a place for themselves in their own community. So the Bone Wars, for those of you who have maybe heard the term before but not heard the story, or who may never have heard of them before, this would have been beginning around, I want to say, the 1840s, 1850s, somewhere around there. You had two paleontologists. You had Marsh and Cope. And Marsh and Cope were what one of the resources we looked at termed gentleman scientists.
Gentleman naturalists.
Gentleman naturalists. In other words, they're not actually being hired to do this stuff. They're going out on their own.
And they're not even necessarily, like, professionals.
Right.
So, like, I always kind of talk about, like, we're in Central Virginia, right? So, by profession, Jefferson was a lawyer, but he was also a gentleman farmer.
Yes.
And so many of the physicians I work with, they are lovely people, but they'll say, I am a physician by trade, but I am also a gentleman farmer. They all have farms on the outside of town.
So the sort of gentleman prefix there lets you know that this is someone who's like, oh, this is my hobby.
Yes. That's exactly it.
This is how I enjoy myself.
Like, they could spend their money from the Industrial Revolution anywhere, but they're going to choose to, like, go on expeditions and find bones.
Yeah. So now, Cope and Marsh, both from wealthy families. And to give you a little bit of context, the big thing that they are known for is their work in studying dinosaurs, and studying the fossil record of dinosaurs. At around about the time that Cope and Marsh were either children or had just been born, was the first time we genuinely defined what dinosaurs were. So they literally were born at the birth of the concept of dinosaur, as we would come to understand it.
And there wasn't really paleontologists either.
Right.
So it's not like anybody went to school to learn how to collect these fossils or identify them or anything like that. It was just kind of almost like, I think, described as like a gold rush.
Yes. Now, Marsh grew up, went to Yale, and studied at Yale, got a degree in natural science at Yale, and then later on, after a couple of other jobs, would wind up actually teaching natural science at Yale. Cope grew up, was always sort of a dabbler in natural science. They didn't mention him having any genuine academic background in it, at least nothing as prestigious as I graduated from Yale with it. But he also worked at a number of museums. So he sort of picked up from his work, his education in natural sciences and natural history, and wound up studying natural science in Germany, which it's actually on a trip to Germany that Marsh first met Cope. And initially, they were very good friends. They were like, hey, a fellow gentleman naturalist, natural scientist, whatever.
Yeah, it just sounds so funny because naturalist, I think we always think of, like, is nudist.
Nudist, yes.
But back in the day, it's like natural history, right?
Yes. So, a fellow gentleman naturalist. Oh, put your clothes on, please.
But this is like, no,
This is-
hunting creatures and doing taxidermy or finding bugs or rocks or anything about natural history.
And if a handful of those archaeological digs just happen to be clothing optional, well. But they became sort of acquainted. They got to be good friends and everything. Then Cope found a skeleton, a dinosaur skeleton. And this was apparently the first real, fracture between them. Was that Cope was studying this skeleton, and he was so eager to get published first on this dinosaur, to be the discoverer of this dinosaur, that he was like, well, you've got this barrel-shaped body, and you've got a skull, and you've got vertebrae that create this sort of short end and long end.
Not to be that person, but I'm going to be that person.
Yeah.
So he found a plesiosaur, which is actually not a dinosaur.
Yes.
It is a marine reptile.
It is a marine reptile, not a dinosaur. She is correct. At the time, though.
Everything was classified as dinosaur.
Yes, at the time, everything was a dinosaur. And he was so eager to show the world, I have discovered a new dinosaur. He's like, okay, barrel body, long spine. A long section of the spine goes off this way. A short section of the spine goes off this way from the barrel. And he's like, well, animals have long tails and short necks. So let's put the skull on the short end of the spine. And that was his view of the creature, the marine reptile, not a dinosaur, although he called it a dinosaur.
I have a goal. So one of the shorts that I've watched with Dr. Emily Grassley talked about the Dimetrodon, which is a synapsid, and we're learning it's kind of called a proto-mammal, even though it wasn't really like a mammal, but they don't really have anything else to kind of define it as. So it's the pterodactyl, the Dimetrodon, and the plesiosaur, which all of us have grown up as little kids and not having an in-depth science education calling them dinosaurs, but they're not dinosaurs. And so somebody made a little shirt that's like, we're not dinosaurs. And they're like, oh man, oh heck, oh geez. And I was like, I need that shirt.
But yeah, so he published his findings, published his diagram of how the skeleton. And then one of the founders of their entire field of study, one of the 1830s paleontologists who first started defining this is what is a dinosaur, and looked at his diagram, looked at the diagrams of the bones that he had published and everything, and said, you've got the head on the wrong end. Like you put the head at the end of the tail. That long piece of the spine that you saw, that's the neck. It's got a long neck and a short tail. And there's some disagreement on this between the sources we saw. Some of them say that this was the early paleontologist, so basically like a grand master in the field who pointed this out. Some say that it was Marsh who pointed this out. What we know is that whoever pointed it out first, Marsh made certain to write to every single scientific publication he could.
He doxed them.
And point out that Cope had screwed up where the skull was supposed to go on this animal. And that was the beginning of this rivalry between the two of them.
You know, that doesn't sound like somebody from Yale. No, I know very nice people from Yale. I'm just teasing.
Yeah. But so Cope and Marsh started becoming this pair of rivals. Who,
very public, like front page newspaper.
Oh, yeah. And when I say rivals, it wasn't just like academic rivalry. Oh, we snipe at each other in the letters pages of academic journals sort of thing. This was, if I see you in the street, I will kill you. Which,
like, it's just so funny because this was, like, also at the time of the Civil War. So you're like, gosh, if these guys were on the front page during the Civil War, like, right after, like, during the Reconstruction, this was serious.
Yeah. So, like we said, they were...
Excuse me.
You're excused. They were gentlemen naturists. So a lot of that was basically going around trying to find places where there were deposits of fossils and trying to be the first person to stake a claim on the deposits of fossils and then hire people to dig the fossils out and ship them back to wherever you actually lived so that you could study them and publish on them. And if that sounds an awful lot like the gold rush, it was. There was actually like a fossil rush in the Midwest that was concurrent with the gold rush on the West Coast. So they wound up in a lot of places at the same time competing with each other over different deposits of fossils. And this led to, on the funnier side of things, a lot of rushing to publication. A lot of, I've got a whole bunch of disconnected bones here, stick them together somehow, okay, now it's going into the journals.
Sniping workers.
Yeah.
Like almost, like there's a lot of things like they would go and throw dirt back into other places that they've excavated, and
that's getting into the less funny end of things there. But the funnier thing is, like, I
said it sounds very like Daffy Duck and Bugs Bunny to me.
Yes.
Like rabbit season.
So the on I guess the less harmful end of things, let's say, was sniping workers from each other, trying to like bribe officials to let them into deposits before another one, that sort of thing.
Or you'd find like a bunch of the same type of bone, but be like, no, I'm really sure that this is all different. It's not like a juvenile and an adult. They'd be like, oh no, it's two different things. It just looks similar.
Which is how you wound up with the Brontosaurus, which is technically, I believe, a juvenile Apatosaurus. So it's an Apatosaurus. It's not a Brontosaurus. There's no such thing as a Brontosaurus. But because one had a juvenile and one had an adult, they both published and were like, I found a completely new species. And one of the researchers we got into talked about it was basically them throwing everything at the wall and being like, as long as I'm the first published on something, the name I give it is going to be the name that sticks. Now, on the less harmless side of things, the much more harmful side of things, which is where I think that this show lives. The Bone Wars are not just called Bone Wars because two people were angry at each other. The Bone Wars are called Bone Wars because they genuinely were fighting with each other. Like Bri said, there was a lot of, hey, while you're there digging out fossils for me, could you go over in the middle of the night and kick all the dirt back in on the excavation the other guy is doing? There was a lot of, hey, what if you just snuck over there and, like...
blew it up.
Yeah, well, I was going to say moved tags around on things that they've tagged. But yes, that was part of it, too. Was what if you found where they are storing all of the bones that are going to be sent back to Cope, and you just stuck a couple of sticks of dynamite in there and lit them and walked away? You know, that... and that also went to, like, deposits where it's like, hey, you found a deposit, you got as many fossils out of it as you could to send to me. Why don't you just dynamite the rest of the deposit so that nobody else can get fossils out of it?
Yeah, we've also been getting back into puppet history, which we said we liked kind of at the very beginning of our
new season of puppet history,
And we're like, oh man, we wish that they would have started a week earlier, or we would have moved this back a week, because we would have like reached out to them and see if they were planning on doing an episode based on this, because it is really interesting, and a lot of different people have done it. My seminal exposure was on The American Experience from PBS, but we have not been able to find it anywhere online now. Not even if you have like PBS Passport. The only thing that we could find was like the trailer. Granted, it's 7 years ago, but you know, the internet lasts forever. So if it's out there, if you have a copy, highly recommend finding it. But I think TLC or the History Channel, like a bunch of other people were doing this story as well. And we were able to find something called the Colorado Experience from a local PBS station in Colorado that are talking kind of about the history of the state. And they really kind of go into depth about this war and a lot of the experiences and stuff like that.
Yeah. And it is, it's this fascinating story of genuinely two people, academics in an academic field, who were willing to see large segments of their own field, the evidence for their own field, the stuff that they were working on, destroyed rather than have the possibility that somebody else might have a shot at getting ahead of them.
And granted, they said there's a lot of other guys that were out there at the same time,
Yeah.
really making great advancements. They said some people were former doctors out in the field in the Civil War that were learning new ways to preserve and plaster the fossils, which we still use today. So they said there was much more good guys than bad guys.
Yeah,
but this was so unique and such an experience that's why we still remember it to this day.
And they were so heavily published as well. Because, like I said, they were rushing out papers as fast as they could go. I think by the end of their lives, it was claimed that together they had published evidence of 130 new dinosaur species. So they were incredibly prolific and incredibly speedy in their work. Nobody really matched them in terms of volume of work they produced, but so much of their work turned out to be garbage. And I feel like that's a very good way to sort of like thematically examine cultural imperialism, because a lot of it is how much can I control the flow, how much can I overwhelm everybody else, and ultimately, does it matter that what I'm putting out is garbage, as long as I can keep anybody else from noticing the good stuff. So I picture this show as and I really wish that I had the name of the movie in front of me. But John Astin made a series of Western movies in the 1960s. And I say a series of Western movies in that he was the star of several Western movies. They were not genuinely a series. Almost every one of them was intended to be the pilot for a television series. And when the TV show didn't get picked up, they put the pilot into movie theaters to try to recoup their investment.
Well, let's ask the chat.
Yes.
Chat, if you happen to know what Glenn is talking about, feel free to speak up, do your research.
And I know that at least some of you in there have seen the movies I'm talking about. The one in particular that I'm thinking of takes place in an Old West town called Molybdenum, which is, of course, supposed to be molybdenum, and everybody in the town refers to the name of the town as Molly Be Dam. And the idea of it is that it's this kind of slowly decaying, turning into a ghost town, because there's nothing worthwhile. They thought they were getting in on the gold rush, but it turns out all they have is that worthless rock Molly Be Dam out in the hills out there, which of course is vitally important for a lot of reasons, but they don't know it. It isn't gold. It's worthless. And there's a whole effort to try to steal the town out from under the people that is based on, no, you don't understand, this is going to be worth an awful lot in the future. So I see this as being a Midwestern sort of like rural town that has discovered a local fossil field. And these two characters rolling into town and sort of the conflict, sort of comicalized, fictionalized conflict between the two of them over the fossil fields of this town. And that gives you a lot of characters then that you can play with. And you can play with what is it like to be in a town where suddenly you have people coming in and declaring that, no, they own the rights to everything in your town. And anything that they don't want used, we're just going to blow that up. So you can have,
Well, and that's still very common right now with say fossil sites on indigenous land.
Oh yeah.
Like they're saying that as recent as I think 2013, there has been this big legal case of, well, we asked and they said, yeah, but we didn't grant permission.
Yeah.
And it's a big issue to the point that on a paleontology road trip, they said, we can't even tell you how we got here. We can't disclose any of this information because so many people have come out and robbed this site from the indigenous people that it is a big concern. In fact, like we would not know how to leave here.
Yeah, well, and this ties in as well that a lot of indigenous peoples all over the world have dealt with the fact that burial sites for their culture have been dug up and excavated to be put into museums. And in several cases, they've had court cases where the museums have been ordered to return the artifacts that they dug up, only to have the artifacts mysteriously go missing before they could be returned. Like someone boxed them up to return them, but then those boxes just disappeared. And they actually have, in some cases I've actually heard they have evidence of like workers at the museum taking the boxes and being like, I'm taking this home because I, as someone who works at the museum, have much more of an interest in preserving these things than the culture they belong to who just wants to put them back into the ground, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and they were also saying, like, this is a big issue because they're trying to get local universities that work on these things to give indigenous people scholarships and trying to get more indigenous scholars in paleontology because this is their land, this is their history. But it's been so hard because everything has been stolen and these people have been pushed into poverty. And so it looks a lot better to say, well, you know, don't go into that education because you can go become a grocery store owner or social work and actually make some money and do some good for people. So they're trying to convince people that no, it's like get the education and kind of take ownership of this. And it's been a really hard cultural shift because so many things have been stolen, but they've not been the recipients or beneficiaries of the wealth.
Yeah. So you can also make a point about that sort of cultural imperialism by having the fossil field be on indigenous land. And having that become a conflict, not just of the people in the local town, being like, hey, you just blew up my my farm, or my cabbage cart. But also having the indigenous peoples be like, this is our land, you know, and you guys are in town hiring the townspeople to come blow up our land. Don't we have some say on what's going on here?
Which would also be really good because we kind of always talk about how hard it is to, you know, it is theater so white sometimes.
Yes.
Like how can you get more stories out there, more opportunities for actors of color?
Yeah.
And so I think having kind of opportunities where indigenous actors can play indigenous people in a compelling, interesting story and kind of reclaim that American history is going to be important.
And as far as the cast of the show, the music of the show, things like that, I think I would be interested in seeing this put together essentially as though it were a Hamilton show. That it is, yes, this is white men in white history and everything like that, but being like, let's bring in BIPOC actors. Let's bring in indigenous actors. Let's bring in black actors, Latino, Hispanic, Asian actors, and let's let them collaborate. Let's bring them in to collaborate on creating how these characters are presented on stage.
And to be honest, they all would have been there as well. You know, absolutely. It's like there was, you know, the Chinese railway workers. So Chinese were already in this country. You know, even I think at the beginning of most sources we found, we were even talking about Jefferson was wondering if Mastodon still lived in the plains.
You mentioned that this would have been around the time of the Civil War. This would have been around the time of Reconstruction. So you would have a lot of possibility for black people who had just been freed from the South, who were looking for a place. A lot of black families moved toward the West
and like
to try to start lives.
I think a lot of people forget that like black and Mexican workers were really cowboys before the white
absolutely.
cowboys. Like we watched Beyonce's Black is King, and you see kind of all the African cattle rangers, and you're like, that is legitimately what a lot of enslaved people unfortunately were put in charge of, because that's what they were experts at.
At the height of what we think of as the cowboy, 3/4 of the people whose job was genuinely out there on the range, riding the range, more than 3/4 were black. Clint Eastwood riding his horse into an all-white town in the West would have been the exception, not the rule.
So I think you could have a very diverse cast that would be historically accurate, which would be like very legitimized. And I think it would be a great opportunity to kind of do what maybe a lot of people criticized about Hamilton of, BIPOC actors playing white people. Like it can be BIPOC actors playing BIPOC characters, and it's a positive and enriching way, and still addressing issues of, racism and imperialism and stuff like that.
Yeah. So I feel like we've got, if you'll pardon the use of the expression, the bare bones of a great show here. Like we've just got to keep anyone from dynamiting it before we, publish.
Well, yeah, and I was telling Glenn before we were discussing this, I said, I was really enamored with the American Experience episode, and I think it was like 2010, 2011, and I thought, well, yeah, no, I'd really love to see this story kind of play out, and then I just kind of like pushed it to the side, because I'm like, I don't want to write about two white guys in history. And then when Glenn kind of brought it up, I said, yeah, no, I think this is interesting. Like, I love the story. I love these kind of like wacky things that just go on, and you're just like, this just proves like there are no rational actors in history in America. And he told me the idea, and I was like, I think that there's definitely something here.
Yeah, I feel like the way you take a story that could very easily be, here's these two white guys fighting, that has been told a million times on the stage. And the way you make it interesting is you make the two white guys fighting, you make them the Mikado in the story. You make them the guys who show up occasionally and drive the plot a little bit.
Or like at the end.
Yeah, but you make the story about everybody having to deal with the fact that these two people exist.
Yeah. I almost love it as like a sort of a Waiting for Godot type of thing. Oh, I've heard about all these great men who are asking us to do these horrible things, and then you kind of see them and they're like, oh. They're kind of gross. Well, and also that was like really common. Like that's the whole thing, is they would say like, Marsh would be at Yale just saying, yeah, tell me how you found it in the ground, just ship it back, and never would go. Would just be like, yeah, you do it for me, and then tell me so I can set it back up here at Yale.
Yeah, and I feel like you would have a great musical number with the guy who's out there looking to like scout people for Marsh's team, doing a big song about when you work for Yale.
Yes.
One of my favorite points that came up in one of the shows
that we watched. Are you talking about the bag? Because I love that point too. It was so great.
Was that one of Marsh's teams was like, we've never done this kind of work before. We don't know the first thing about excavating fossils, so can you like send us a technical manual on how to do this or something? And Marsh sent them the fossil collection guidelines for the Yale Department of Natural History. And the fossil collection guidelines were basically, get a sack, walk through the field, pick up the fossil, put the fossil in the sack, mail the sack back to Yale.
That was so great. It's like that. I don't know if you ever remember the bear cartoons in Disney, the Humphrey the Bear.
Yes.
Like, put it in the sack. Da-da-da-da-da.
See, now I was thinking of the goofy cartoons with like how to ski, how to play football,
kind
that
of
sort
all
of
at
thing.
the same time.
Yeah, you know.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that this has a potential to be a show about a serious topic, but also a show that can be very funny.
Yeah.
A show that can have a lot of opportunities for not just slapstick humor, but really good humor about, like, poking fun at sort of, like, the establishment of the time.
Yeah, and I think that that's really important. Too often we kind of talk about, it's sometimes very, very hard when you're producing a piece of musical theater, because not that you can't deal with serious issues or sad things, but you still need to kind of like end on a note where people want to come back and see it, or they want to tell other people to come see it. So, as I mean, I hope I'm not ruining any shows for people, but, you think of something like Fun Home, or you think of something like Hadestown in recent years, where they're maybe not happy 100% of the time, but it ends in a way that the tunes are still really hummable, you still are very excited to buy the soundtrack, and you're still very excited for everyone to come see the show.
Yeah.
So I think that this kind of finds that right balance of, innumerable amount of American history was just decimated and lost to the ages, and we can't get it back.
Yeah.
And really having kind of good lessons about what these complex things are, where I feel like if mentioned in a lecture might make people very defensive.
Yeah.
Well, you don't want us having dinosaur bones? Well, how have we learned anything? So I think that it allows other voices to be heard and really address the issues in kind of a complicated way that I think people can kind of understand better through being presented in a musical.
And one of the ways that there are lots of ways that you can end on that sort of note. I think one of the best examples I've heard on a soundtrack is Bloody Bloody Andrew Jackson. The actual finale of the show, like the last song of the show, is a very slow, heartfelt piece about what does it mean to have a history so stained with blood. What does it mean that you go out there and you say, I'm going to make the world into this thing, and you do everything, even the things that hurt people, that create this sort of like carving a path through sort of thing. And then what you have is the moment that the audience can leave on like energized and fun is the curtain call number, which is a rock and roll version of the Hunters of Kentucky. So, you have the audience leaving the theater being like, oh, Kentucky, the Hunters up. Yeah, So I feel like you have an opportunity with creating the characters of this town, that you can have a show that closes on an introspective number about how history can be wiped out by people who think that they're doing the best thing, because they're ultimately doing the best thing for themselves and not for the actual history. And then close on a curtain number that's actually like a fun, rollicking number with the people of the town, sort of thing.
Oh, yeah. And I think that is the hardest thing when you're dealing with social issues, is I think we all really struggle with that. I mean, I hope I'm not being hyperbolic in this, but I really feel like us as human beings, especially us as Americans, we constantly think, what can I do to keep a roof over my head and my family happy and fed and advance myself and make money? Because these are all things that we need to get by. But I think also we've had many, many years of prosperity where I think many of us think, well, what can I do? And, we actually talked about this philosophical concept where there are people out there who are questioning, if you walk along one day, you're going to a fancy dinner party, and you see a child drowning in a lake, and you're wearing like a $600 suit and shoes and everything, you just know it's going to get ruined, and there's nobody else there to save the child. Many of us would jump in without hesitation to get that child, because that's a life saved, and you can always buy a new suit. That's not a problem. But when we sit there and we think about, well, what if that child is dying of hunger halfway across the world, and we have that $600 to give to them, would we still do that? And many people say, no, I wouldn't. I don't know that child. And there are people out there that say, to be philosophically good, you must give up anything that you can spare in order to save your fellow man. And so I think that this issue in particular really wrestles with that in a specific example, but in a way that we can all have that reflection. What do we do that is pushing our own advancement? And there's nothing wrong with being ambitious, but what are we doing kind of at the expense of our community and our society? And I know we're struggling with that right now during the pandemic. And that's something that I think is on everybody's mind right now. now, even if it wasn't before, as far as like, are we good people? Are we doing good in the world? And are we like doing good in our career?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, Kentucky.
And on that note,
yes,
we're so happy you're here to join us this, well, it's gloomy here. Gloomy Saturday afternoon. I had to, like, go splash some water on my face and wake myself up, but,
yes, I've been drinking my hibiscus tea here the entire time.
But we know your time is valuable. We're happy you spent it with us. If you like this idea for show, if you'd like us to work on it, please tweet at either one of us. Please put a comment down in the YouTube. If you can think of the old Western that Glenn was talking about, tweet at us, put it in the comment.
I know it's frequently sold on a DVD with Evil Roy Slade is the other movie. I don't think it's Evil Roy Slade. I think it's the other movie that's usually with that one. But yes.
And if you have any more information about paleontology, the Bone Wars, or anything like that, I am always looking for great YouTube videos to watch or PBS videos to watch. I have not subscribed to Passport yet, but I've been gobbling up anything dinosaur related, because if you can't go back to your childhood loves during the pandemic, when can you?
And she hasn't realized yet that we still have a subscription to Acorn TV.
I know. Isn't that horrible? I'm not watching little old lady murder mysteries. I'm just really, really interested in where do we come from and how have viruses evolved. I am so interested in antigens and blood. I cannot even tell you. I'm like going back to all my loves of why I thought I could be a chemistry major in college.
All right, so
and you're sure glad I didn't do that. Hopefully you're sure glad I didn't do that as well, and have enjoyed the Musical QuaranStream. We love you.
Yes, we love you very much. You can visit our coffee site, Ko-Fi Coffee. I pronounce it both ways. I can't be bothered to learn how to pronounce somebody else's trademark. But you can visit our Ko-Fi site. You can visit our bookshop. You can visit my Patreon. If you join my Patreon today, you'll still get to see the YouTube video before it goes live on Monday. But on Monday, there's a new Film Optimist coming out. And thank you for tuning in.
And I just got my fingers crossed that, speaking of bones and all this promotion money, that Glenn makes enough so I can go buy all the cute new decor at Michael's for Halloween.
Yes. Halloween is coming up. Our favorite holiday, Halloween.
Mwah.
All right, love you guys. Mwah. Take care of yourselves, because you know we're not there to take care of you. And we'll see you again. Bye.
Lunchtime!